Hello and welcome to this lecture introduction to John Stuart Mill. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce this week's philosopher, John Stuart Mill, provide some context and philosophical background, give some tips for understanding and reading the assignment. I'm going to go through the structure of the essay and talk about some of Mill's philosophical assumptions. Let's start with the background. John Stuart Mill was a British intellectual, a civil servant, and a politician who lived from 1806 to 1873. He is considered by some to be the most significant English-speaking thinker in the 19th century. He published significant and influential texts in philosophy, economics, social and political theory, religion, and current affairs. Interestingly, though he was a leading intellectual, Mill never held a position at a university, but worked for 35 years for the East Indian Trade Company. He started as a junior clerk and rose through the ranks throughout his career. In 1865, he was elected to the British Parliament and served one 3-year term. During the term, he was the second member of Parliament ever to call for women's rights to vote. Mill's picture of the good life and his views on morality are interconnected with his social and political views. You can see evidence of this in our reading assignment. For example, on page 625, Mill writes that the present wretched education and social arrangements are the only real hindrances to its, the most valuable good, being attainable by all. What Mill is saying here is that almost all people would be able to attain the most valuable good, given the appropriate education and social arrangements. The current wretched arrangements he refers to in this passage are the institutions such as the laws that allow some people more liberties than others, and social structures such as class structure, traditional family structure, and the Victorian customs and values that held sway in England at the time, which prevented some, especially women, from achieving the equality of freedom and complete well-being. This is a big hint that Mill thinks that the most valuable good is a societal good, or one that must be produced by or implemented in the social structures of a society. This does not mean it's not also a personal good. It could be both. The fact that he considers the most valuable good to be a societal good explains why his social and political views are so intertwined with his views on morality and the good life. So to help us understand his picture of the good life more fully, I'm going to give a little background on his social and political views. Both as a politician and as an intellectual, Mill was a proponent of basic civil liberties. Civil liberties of expression and conscience, which would include freedom of speech and religion, freedoms of taste and pursuit of life plans, and freedoms of association. While these freedoms are basically just given in American society, these were not necessarily freedoms that in Mill's time the British people thought that all people ought to have. Mill, in his political philosophy, was also an advocate of the harm principle. According to the harm principle, the only legitimate restriction on individual liberty is to prevent harm to another. At the same time, however, he was an active proponent of social and economic reforms in the areas of taxation, labor, education, and health. He thought that these reforms should redress the effects of inequality, meaning he thought that the society should reform their tax laws and their labor laws and their education laws to make sure that everybody in the society had equal access to education, healthcare, and opportunities for employment and to have a safe working environment. He reconciles his sort of libertarian tendencies towards civil liberties, right? Especially the harm principle is a sort of libertarian view that the government should stay out of everything unless they are protecting individual liberty. So he reconciles that sort of libertarian stream of thought with his more socialist tendencies toward certain types of wealth redistribution, that is, distributing the wealth in a way that allows for more equality, in the following way. First, he says that in order for everybody in society to be effectively and equally to be able to make use of their basic civil liberties, these things, they need to have sufficient income, safe working conditions, bargaining power, access to health care and healthy living conditions, and a quality education with literacy as a basic minimum requirement. And they need to have employment opportunities. So first part of his argument is if people are to make effective use of their basic civil liberties, then they need certain conditions to be in place. They need to have an income. They need safe working conditions. They need access to health care. They need access to education and literacy. Secondly, he would argue that the inability to effectively make use of civil liberties because one does not have sufficient physical and intellectual resources is a great harm to that person. Therefore, by the harm principle, it is legitimate to place some restrictions on the privileges of the advantaged classes, and particularly on their freedom of pursuit of life plans by redistributing some portion of their wealth to pay for the educational opportunities of those who can't afford them. This restriction on the liberty or the privileges of the advantaged is only legitimate, however, in order to prevent harm. In this case, the harm would be the inability of other people to make effective use of their civil liberties. So, to sort of summarize, he has a sort of libertarian leaning that the government should not have a lot of power, that it's only legitimate restriction that it can place on individual liberties is to prevent harm to another person. On the other hand, he has a sort of socialist leanings in terms of wanting to reform economics in order to redress the effects of inequality, and that means to some extent redistributing the wealth to give everybody a more equal access to education, healthcare, and employment. And these two tendencies seem to be in conflict because if the government is redistributing the wealth, then it seems to be doing more than just protecting individual liberties. He reconciles these two seemingly disparate views by arguing that people who don't have sufficient economic and intellectual and physical resources are unable to make use of their basic civil liberties, which is a great harm to those people, and therefore using the legal system and economic reforms to redistribute to some extent the wealth would prevent that harm to the people, to the least advantaged people in the society. In addition to, in keeping with his views on liberty and equality, Mill was a very strong advocate, both politically and intellectually, for women's equality, which in his day was not a popular position. In Mill's time, in Britain, women had fewer grounds for divorce than men. Husbands controlled their wives' personal property, with an occasional exception of land. Children were considered the husband's. Rape was legally impossible within a marriage because the wife was subordinate to and expected to obey her husband. And wives lacked crucial features of legal personhood, since the husband was taken as a representative of the family, which is the justification, for example, of why women were denied the right to vote. In his essay, The Subjection of Women, Mill argued that because the current marriage laws gave husbands complete control over the person and property of their wives, marriage was a legal form of slavery. Marriage, he writes, is the only actual bondage known to our law. There remain no legal slaves except the mistress of every house. In this context, Mill advocated for women's equality to education, to professional opportunities, and to vote in political elections and to run for political office. He also advocated for women to have the basic freedoms of expression, worship, and association, which he had reason to assume were often restricted by a woman's husband, father, or other male guardian. He argued that women's equality in all domains was good for both the society as a whole, and he says that granting women equality would lead to an increase of the general fund of thinking and acting power and an improvement in the general conditions of the associations of men and women. He also argued that it would be good for women and as individuals, and for him this is just as important. It would be a grievous understatement of the case to omit the most direct benefit of all, the unspeakable gain in private happiness to the liberated half of the species, the difference to them being between a life of subjection to the will of others and a life of rational freedom. After the primary necessities of food and raiment, freedom is the first and strongest want of human nature. Here he is saying that freedom is for human beings a central component of human happiness or well-being. To deny women equal freedom and liberty is to deny them a full share of the good life. Now that you have some background on Mill's social and political views, let me give you some tips for reading and understanding the text. This is basically the same advice I gave for Aristotle, but with one new piece. So, print and annotate the text. Read the text a couple of times. First, read through, get the big picture, the overall argument. What is his highest good? How does he say this is the highest good? Go for a second time, read to fill in the details and nuances and supplemental arguments. Don't speed read. Read the footnotes and paraphrase. On the first read through, if you can't paraphrase part of the text, put a question mark by it, and then on the second read through, try to paraphrase, especially the parts with question marks by them. If you still can't paraphrase them, post a question about it on the general forum discussion board. Use the dictionary to look up those words you don't know or that are being used in a way that's unfamiliar to you. And here's the new bit of advice. Mill discusses positions he doesn't accept at all. Part of Mill's strategy in developing his argument for his picture of the good life is to raise what he sees as the most powerful or frequent objections to his views, and then to defend his views from those objections. So in fact, in the reading that we have, it reads almost like a debate between Mill and his objectors. Mill offers a claim of his own. He explains the objections to that claim and then defends his claim and further explains his views by responding to the objection. So it's your job as a careful reader to identify the objections that Mill discusses but doesn't agree with, and then to identify his responses to those objections, his defense of his views from those objections. I'm going to now move on to discuss one of the main underlying assumptions that Mill makes in the text, and understanding this assumption should help you to sort of understand what's going on in the text. He doesn't ever explicitly state this assumption, so I'm going to say it for you here. A moral theory, a theory of the good, must derive its principles from an account of the most valuable good. So a moral theory is a theory of how one ought to act or be, and he's saying this moral theory has to derive its principles, its rules, its standards from an account of the most valuable good. Actions are morally right and good when they promote or increase that most valuable good. Actions are morally wrong when they diminish or decrease the most valuable good. So that's the underlying assumption of the text. It's carried all through the text, even though he doesn't necessarily say it explicitly. It may help you also to understand, the big picture of his argument on that first read through. Let me discuss the structure of the essay a bit. First, he explains the main principle of his moral theory. His moral theory is called utilitarianism, and its main principle is the greatest happiness principle. So the first thing that he does in his essay and his argument is to introduce the main principle of his moral theory, the greatest happiness principle. Next, he explains his theory of life or human nature. This theory is important because it is from his views on human nature, his theory of life, that he derives his idea of the most valuable good. His most valuable good is based on his picture or view of human nature. And then this most valuable good, in turn, serves as the foundation of his moral theory. So, after stating his theory of life or his picture of human nature, he spends a long time addressing a major objection to that theory. And then in defending his theory from that objection, he further clarifies his view of human nature and his main principle of morality. And he identifies a standard for ranking the value of different kinds of pleasures. The third piece of his argument, he explains how he derives his idea of the most valuable good from his view of human nature. So in part 1, he explains the main principle of his moral theory. In part 2, he explains his theory of life or his theory of human nature, and then next he moves on to define his most valuable good and explain how he gets that as the most valuable good from his picture of human nature. And he explains how his most valuable good is derived from his views of human nature through a series of objections and responses. He addresses several objections to his most valuable good and to his moral theory. In addressing his objections and defending himself from these objections, he explains the main reasons he thinks people fail to achieve that highest or most valuable good, and he gives some thought to what can be done to promote the most valuable good for all people. Finally, in chapter 4, he explains what would have to be done to prove that his moral theory is true and to prove that his most valuable good really is the most valuable good. In doing this, he states his criteria for determining which good is more valuable than all other goods. So as you're reading through Mill, like trying to get the big picture, especially on that first read through, keep in mind that this is sort of the structure of the essay. And that is all I have to say to you about John Stuart Mill, so happy reading.